Awesome. We just got the go ahead. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to our school community, to our virtual town hall to discuss school start times. I want to welcome our distinguished panel this evening. We have with us Dr. Lisa Meltzer, Professor of Family Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, Professor of Pediatrics at the National Jewish Health, and the diplomat of the Board of Behavioral Sleep Medicine. So, welcome, Dr. Meltzer. We also have with us Dr. Amanda Hassinger, the Clinical Associate Professor, Department of Pediatrics at the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, UBMD Pediatric Sleep Center. Welcome, Dr. Hassinger. We also have Dr. Gary Snyder with us. Dr. Snyder is an adjunct professor at Virginia Tech School of Education and a former superintendent in Princeton, New Jersey. So Dr. Snyder will be sharing with us the process he went through in Princeton. We also have Dr. Larry Wall. Dr. Wall is the Director of Strategic Planning for the Webster Central School District. He's going to share the Webster Central School District story with us. We also have our very own Mr. Keith Bortman, who is the principal of Williamsville South High School. Principal Bortman is the chair of our school start time committee that began in 2023 and the 2024 school year. We also have Principal Dan Wald. Dr. Wall, our Dr. Wall here in Williamsville, is a principal of Transit Middle School, and Dr. Wall has been on our school start time committee from the beginning, as well as Mr. Chris Mukshika, who is our Director of Athletics, Health and Physical Education, and our District Medical Director, Ms. Christine Harding. So thank you all for being panelists this evening. I greatly appreciate it. And I thank you for volunteering your time. So I want to make it very clear to our school community that none of the panelists were paid for being panelists this evening. We thank them for dedicating their time to this very important topic. So we're going to start, just so that we're all grounded on how we arrived here, we're going to start with a very short PowerPoint. So Nick, if you can begin that PowerPoint, I greatly appreciate it. Advance to the next slide. So to date, as you know, at the January Board of Education meeting, we had members of our school start time committee, the four that are on the meeting this evening, come and present all of the history, all of the findings, and the proposal for the school start time. And from that time until this coming Friday, we have opened up a feedback form. And to date, we have more than 1,600 submissions of feedback that have been received and that the Board of Education is reviewing. They are reviewing each and every submission, every piece of feedback they receive, and every email that has been sent. Next slide. So some of the pressure points, and we'll get to some of these this evening: the impact on after-school activities, sports and extracurricular commitments, transportation and logistical challenges, the increased need for and cost of childcare, safety concerns for children waiting for buses in the dark, disruption to family routines and work schedules. And then some of the positives we'll talk about is the support for later school start times, how it's in alignment with the research, how it leads to better mental health, has a positive impact on attendance, improved focus and engagement for our students. So what we've done as a district also, because we've gotten a lot of feedback about other districts that have either done this, some districts that have done this and reverted back, we wanted to make sure we reached out and spoke with those districts. So we actually had a meeting with the administrators from the Webster Central School District, Superintendent Brian Neenan, and Dr. Larry Wall, who is with us today. We met with the Fairport Central School District Superintendent. Many of you may know Fairport voted to have later start times, but they will not be implementing until the 26-27 school year. The Clarence Central School District, their high school currently starts after 8:50 a.m. We had discussions with them, and some of our high school students will be meeting with students at Clarence High School tomorrow. Had discussions with Alden Central School District. 2 years ago, Alden moved their times till later for their students. And we spoke with Superintendent Adam Stoltman, and our students will also be meeting with students out in Alden on February 13th. And we also had discussion with the superintendent, Mr. Joe D'Angelo, in the Maryville Central School District. Maryville had later start times, and then they reverted to earlier start times. So we have a good basis of understanding what every district went through. Next slide. So some of the district discussions, implementation needs and considerations, we know they vary district to district and community to community. So discussion items with other school districts will be discussed also during this virtual forum. And we're very happy that we're able to have some of those individuals with us this evening. Now, one thing we also will touch upon is that the New York State Senate bill on school start times was reintroduced a week after our district's initial proposal. So that is Senate Bill 2361. And we also know that states, Florida and California, now have state laws regarding school start times. The California law is already in place. The Florida law goes in place in the 26-27 school year, and those move their start times back. We also know that New Jersey reintroduced their school start time bill in the New Jersey House of Legislature. And I know it was initially introduced in 2022, and Channel 7 did a story about it, and Dr. Hassinger was actually interviewed for that story, and that bill was reintroduced just last year. So we know that this is something that's being taken very seriously nationwide. So our next steps, continuing to receive feedback and stakeholder feedback through February 7th on our district website. Our February 11th Board of Education meeting, there will be a lot of attention and discussion at that meeting. And in April, we will begin our transportation efficiency survey because we want to make sure that we're able to align our school start times as best as possible, realizing how many students need transportation and how many students will be on our buses. So thank you very much for allowing me to set the stage and to level set where we're at for this evening. So I am going to get started with questions. And the first set of questions will be really examining the research and the research base for this school start time move. So we're going to focus really our questions towards Dr. Lisa Meltzer and Dr. Amanda Hassinger. So our district has reviewed a great deal of research in regard to later school start times. In your experience, what are the most important aspects of the research in regard to moving school start times later for secondary students? And how will this change ultimately benefit our students?
I don't know if Dr. Meltzer wants to go first. I think you mentioned you had some slides, or would you like me to start answering questions?
You go first, and then I'll follow up with what else needs to be added.
Sure. Okay. I mean, I think the thing that's the most important for teenagers and adolescents is to realize that they are still growing and developing when they sleep at night. So they still need more sleep than adults do, even though they're starting to get more responsibilities, more extracurriculars, starting to work and doing those things that do fill up a day. So although adults can survive and have no medical consequences if they get 7 hours of sleep at night, a teenager can have significant medical consequences if they don't get 8 to 10 hours of sleep at night. And the things that we see the most are really scary things like depression, anxiety, suicidal attempts, not just thinking about it, problems with every single part of their existence, because sleep affects how their body grows, how it heals, how it functions, and how the most important part of their brain actually develops. So until we're about 25 years old, our frontal lobe is still growing and developing when we sleep at night. And the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that controls all of the higher level thinking, our IQ, our problem solving, our emotional reactions to things, the things that really are important and difficult for adolescents and young adults to have issues with if they're trying to navigate life. And so I think we actually call in the sleep community, being a teenager in the United States, the perfect storm, because they still need more sleep than adults do, but they have way more work, way more commitment, and they're at a phase in human existence when their biological clock wants them to go to sleep the latest than any other phase in our human lifespan. Teenagers want to go to bed later than any other part of our infants, toddlers, school-age kids, adults, geriatric patients. So their natural biological clock is telling them to fall asleep at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. But if their school starts at 7:20 or 7:30, they have to wake up much earlier than their body wants to. So it's a perfect storm where they have too much work, they want to fall asleep later, but they have to wake up earlier. So that leads to, and some of the estimates, and Dr. Meltzer, I defer to you on the most recent epidemiology, but some of the estimates is that 80% of US teenagers do not get enough sleep. And that is a significant portion related to their school schedules. So this is something that has been a national conversation for sleep doctors for decades, because it's something that we can fix that has significant consequences on the health and quality of life of teenagers in the United States.
Thank you very much.
So I just wanted, by way of introduction, so I'm a pediatric sleep psychologist, and I have been in the field 25 years and been advocating for school start time changes that long. The first studies that came out were done in Minnesota by Dr. Kyla Wallstrom in Edina, Minnesota, really showing the benefits of changes, and studies have continued to go from there. But I'm not just a researcher, I'm also a parent. My son is now in high school. He was in elementary school when our district decided to change, and I will be discussing a lot of data from our district. And so I just want you to understand, this is the Cherry Creek School District. It is in suburban Denver. The district has 55,000 students, so it is considerably larger than your district, but a lot of parallels, 104 square miles, so also a very big coverage area like your district, and also relatively, in terms of the demographics, relatively similar. So our district is 29% free and reduced lunch, your district's 21%. A lot of parallels in terms of the success of our students, the success of our athletic teams, as well as the incredible stress and worry that our district went through when it went through this process. And our process changed in the fall of 2017. Our school district changed, and I was given permission by our then superintendent, Dr. Scott Siegfried, to do a multi-year evaluation. And it was unlike any evaluation that's been done before. We did in-school surveys to ensure that we collected data from as many students as possible. We did those before the change, after the change, and then 2 years after the change. We had surveys from teachers, we had surveys from parents and staff members. We also had focus groups with high school students, teachers, and parents. And so a ton of data. I will try not to get into the weeds with it today, but I just want you to know that a lot of when I talk about things comes from actual data, whether it be the qualitative responses that we received afterwards or at the actual numbers that we have. So the major benefits in terms of changing this, increased sleep duration, as Dr. Hessinger is mentioned, is the top one. That's always been the reasoning behind it. And it's based on the biological science that she mentioned as well. So melatonin, as you may or may not know, is a naturally produced hormone. We all have it, we all make it, and melatonin is released when it's dark out, and that helps prepare our bodies for sleep. But when adolescents go through puberty, the timing of that melatonin is delayed by 1 to 2 hours. And there are hardcore, really cool sleep summer camp studies where they determined this factor. And it happens for all adolescents, this inability to fall asleep early enough and then to wake up. And so what happens is when we ask teens to go to bed at 9 or 10 p.m. in order to get enough sleep, they're at the peak of wakefulness. And then at 7 a.m. when we ask them to wake up, in many cases, get behind the wheel of a car, they're at the peak of physiological sleepiness. And that is why it is important to have later school start times for high schoolers. It's important to have later school start times for middle schoolers who are going through puberty and starting to shift and be unable to fall asleep early. Elementary school students don't have that biological shift. Yes, many of them go to bed late and wake up late, but as parents of elementary school students, you probably noticed most elementary school students don't sleep in like your teens or your middle schoolers will, right? They wake up. And that ability to move their schedules back a little bit to adjust to an earlier school start time is feasible. It does require planning. It does require some very conscious decisions, but they can go to bed earlier to make up for waking up earlier, whereas middle school and high schoolers don't. So in our district, we also flipped elementary schools. Our elementary schools had started at 9 a.m. and they moved to 8 a.m. And I can tell you at the time, like I said, my son was in elementary school and I was not a popular parent at the bus stop because nobody wanted to wake up early, but everybody adjusted and they figured it out. The middle schools, just so you know, in our district moved from 8 to 8:50, and our high schools started at 7:10 and moved to 8:20. So it's a little bit different than the way yours are changing, but there's still many overlaps. So why, as Dr. Hessinger mentioned, sleep is so important is because sleep is tied to every aspect of daytime functioning. So mood, right? So that's the first thing you notice when your kid doesn't get enough sleep. They're either irritable, cranky, some young kids get hyper, but there are higher rates of depression, as she mentioned, suicidal attempts. All of these things are linked to insufficient sleep, as is stress. Right? Weight gain, we know, is another factor that we see when kids don't get enough sleep. Despite, even if you're watching their diet and whatever, they're going to gain weight. We know that it's related to all of the hormones that are being regulated during sleep. From our data, we know, and from other studies that also looked at this, improved attendance, especially in those first and second period classes. And we not only have data for that, we have in our focus groups, the kids were saying, last year I flunked math or I flunked Spanish because it was in the first period and I was asleep, or I couldn't get there because I couldn't wake up in time. So that better academics performance in the morning, teachers noticed it, parents noticed that kids were less grumpy. They were actually able to have conversations. The kids ate breakfast, more energy, less tired. Kids were reporting fewer migraines, fewer headaches, more sun exposure. We get more sun exposure here in Denver than you might up where you guys are located, but still to not have to go to school in the dark and come home in the dark was one of the things that students expressed was one of their favorite things about the change in start times.
I want to follow up on that because you touched upon the elementary school start times, and our proposal moves our high school times later, but we also move elementary times earlier by 25 minutes to 7:50 a.m. And if you can let me know, what do you think is the key start time for elementary? And secondly, can you speak to the effect of earlier start times on elementary students? Does it affect their health, their mood, or their academic performance?
I can say it actually will probably improve their mood and their academic performance. Just as
Awesome.
Dr. Meltzer said, the biological clock of an elementary school student wants to wake up at 6 and is most alert at 6:30 and 7. Those are when those children are up, even on the weekends. Think about your kids
Right.
that wake up on the weekends when they don't have school. That's just their natural sleep offset time. That is when a child of that age should wake up. That's when they naturally wake up. We may have changed that because of the schedule that they're on now, but it will be easier, as Dr. Meltzer said, to adjust that to an earlier start time in a 5-year-old than it would be in a 15-year-old. And it will not affect their duration of sleep. It will not affect their sleep health. It would actually probably align their daily schedule more naturally with their actual biological clock, which we know makes their body function much better. Not just how awake they are and how alert they are, but every part of your body, their immune system, their GI tract, their mood, all of those things are synchronized with their circadian rhythm. And if their daily schedule matches that of a 5-year-old, it will be healthier for them. So moving elementary student start times earlier is definitely healthier for their body and their sleep.
And from the science standpoint, again, there's only been 2 studies that have actually looked at sleep pre and post change. And so the first study was done in Massachusetts, and they moved their times for 3rd graders who were starting at 9:10 to 7:45. So that's similar to your 7:50. Their 4th and 5th graders moved from 8:20 to 7:45. And what they found in terms of total sleep time was the 3rd graders actually got more sleep, but the amount of sleep decrease was 4 minutes for 4th graders and 9 minutes for 5th graders. So not a lot. In Cherry Creek, where we had about 8,000 students that we surveyed, and we looked at it K through 3 because they have different sleep needs. They need a little bit more sleep than those are K through 2 versus the 3 through 5. And what we found is on average, they got about 10 to 11 minutes less sleep per night. And that was because bedtimes got moved 10 minutes earlier and wake times were about 20 minutes earlier. Okay. So again, they weren't moved proportionately. And if those bedtimes in the second year follow-up, we actually saw the bedtimes did get a little bit earlier to help compensate for that as families adjusted and realized the need to do that. So if bedtimes are adjusted accordingly, and there's a lot of education around sleep health, there should not be problems with waking up. In our focus group data, what we found were that morning routines were the same for many families. Some families did report they were a little bit more rushed because a lot of families with that 9 a.m. start time, you got a lot of time in the morning to get homework done and pack lunches and all of that kind of stuff. So it required families to plan more in the evenings. It required them to shift some of those morning activities to the evenings. Otherwise, their mornings felt a little bit more rushed. But families and kids, they really liked having more time after school, more time for play when they got done earlier. it was easier for a lot of working parents who didn't have to then pay for before and after school care, right? You can just drop your kid off and go to work, and then they're set and ready to go. Teachers in particular noted both through surveys and in focus groups that their students were more alert and ready to learn in the morning. A lot of, our preschool or before school care opened at 7. And with school not starting until 9, kids came and played for 2 hours before school started, and they were exhausted by 9 a.m. But when school started at 8, kids were ready to go, and they learned better. And teachers noted that they didn't fade over the course of the day, that they stayed engaged until their dismissal time, and they really appreciated that. I will say, as students get to that 4th and 5th grade and they start to head into the pre-puberty years, those tween years, it is a little bit harder to wake them up. But that's just part of the adjustment for think how hard it'll be once they hit middle school. So
Right.
there's no one perfect solution for every kid. My perfect solution is every kid starts between 8:30 and 9. But with transportation logistics, that's not feasible. 8 o'clock was really good in Cherry Creek schools. Like I said, this other district went to 7:45. I think your state law is looking at 8 a.m. There is also something very psychologically different about starting at 7:50 versus 8 a.m. It is only 10 minutes, but that 7 o'clock hour is really hard to think about starting school in. So I don't know that there's a perfect solution. I think there's a lot that families will have to consider. It is a big adjustment in the first year. It's a smaller adjustment in the second year. We are now almost 8 years, 7 years out. Nobody even remembers what life was like before, and they figure out a way to make it work for their family.
Thank you very much for that. Now, you did mention bedtimes, and that leads us into our next question, because part of the feedback we are receiving is that a conclusion many community members and school community members have reached is that if students have a later school start time, they will simply stay up later the night before to complete homework, or just stay up later because they know they have a later school start time. Is that actually true?
No.
Yeah, no, no, it actually, I mean, they're going to fall asleep when their natural body wants to fall asleep. If you try to force it earlier because they have to wake up earlier, you're going to be less successful than if you let them fall asleep when their body wants to and let them wake up when their body wants to. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because they want to stay up and look at TikTok longer. It's physiologically when their body wants to sleep. And if you have them sleeping at a time that matches when their circadian rhythm is ready to sleep, they have higher quality sleep, they're able to fall asleep easier, and they're able to actually function better the next day, which will help them be more active, have more work done, more commitments, more activities, so that they're ready for bed when the next night comes. So, and I'll defer to Dr. Meltzer for the exact science, but in most of the literature I've ever read about this, it actually increases the amount of sleep that teenagers get because they're able to adjust to sleeping on the schedule they need to.
Yeah, so I am going to pull up one of my slides to share, just because I think it's easier to look at this some ways. But not a single study has shown that kids stay up significantly later. Okay, so on this graph, what you're looking at across the bottom is the pre-change. So before we changed times, post was the first year, and follow-up was the second year. This is bedtime on a clock hour. So 1950 is 7:30 and 2350 is 11:30. This pink line, these are the K through 2 students. You see, again, they went to bed slightly earlier and even slightly earlier in the follow-up year. The green, as I mentioned, was the later elementary school, 3 through 5. Again, the earlier to the earlier. Here's our middle schoolers. They went to bed on average 9 minutes later. 9 minutes later, and that was maintained. And then these are our high schoolers. They went to bed on average 14 minutes later. Okay, so yes, tiny bit, but when you look at what happens in the morning, these are the wake times. The green and the pink lines were identical. That's why you only see one line here. They are literally on top of each other. But these are our middle schoolers, right? They are waking up 37 minutes later. Our high schoolers were waking up 60 minutes later. And when you put the bedtime and the wake time together, what you see are significant increases in sleep duration. So again, here's our high schoolers on average sleeping an extra 45 minutes per day. And our middle schoolers were sleeping an extra 30 minutes per day. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's an extra 2.5 hours for middle schoolers per week. And for our high schoolers, it's an extra over 4 hours per week of extra sleep. There is no singular sleep intervention to increase sleep duration as quickly as healthy school start start times. And one of the places you see that is on the weekends. There's this thing called weekend oversleep. Again, if any of you are parents of teenagers, they sleep an extra 2 hours on weekends to try and catch up from lost sleep during the week. And you see that here, this black line is 2 extra hours on the weekends. And that's what our high schoolers were doing. And post change, they were just over an hour. So they were no longer what we would consider clinically significant sleep deprived, and that they were able then to get enough sleep during the week that they didn't have to spend their weekends trying to catch up. And so I think that that's just really important to understand. The bedtimes slightly later, wake times significantly later, and that's where the extra sleep is gained. Wake times for students K through 12 are set by what time they have to be at school.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for those slides. That visual was very helpful. One of our parents, because what we did is we allowed our school community members to submit questions prior to, just so that we can be prepared and just so that there's not duplication of questions. One of our parents referenced a University of Kentucky study linking earlier elementary school start times to lower academic achievement. Is this applicable to districts looking to move elementary times earlier? And what are some of the pitfalls we should avoid?
Are you familiar with that study, Dr.
I
Meltzer?
am. Do you want me to take
Okay,
one?
so I defer to you on that answer.
Okay, so I'm going to go back and share on this one because it's a really valid question, and it was one that came up in our district as well. I will tell you, elementary school, it is the biggest fear. It is the group, middle schoolers and high schoolers, they're excited about sleep. So the studies that Dr. Keller did, there were a couple of them. One looked at academic performance, one looked at behavior. These were not pre-post change studies. These were studies where she took state level data and ran some analyses that I'll show you some statistic things on that even I is over my head, but just to get a sense of it. She used statistical models to predict how school start times would impact academics and behavior. That said, start times were calculated as the number of minutes from midnight. So she did not compare schools that started early versus schools that started later. What she did was look to see, okay, your school starts X number of minutes after midnight for an early school, plus if it's a later school. This is the breakdown of the different schools that were in her study. Only one started before 7:20. Quite a lot started between 7:20 and 7:59, but we're not sure how many of those started at 7:50 or 7:55, or where is that sort of sweet cut point, because it was all grouped together. You have the 8 to 8:29 kids, 8:30 to 8:59, and then this last group. So that's the breakdown of the schools that were in this, but again, it wasn't a comparison of early versus late. This is the statistical model she used. So NAPD is a Kentucky state assessment, novice, associate, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's their state assessments. And what she took was, let's look at how much start time plays a role, how much being on free and reduced lunch, how much start time by free and reduced lunch, whether or not you had an African-American background, Hispanic background, and TS ratio is teacher to student ratio. So proportionately, how much do each of these things account for academic functioning? Okay. This is a table. It's a lot of numbers. It's a lot of things. What I really want you to pay attention to, so across the top are the different academic areas. And I want you to pay attention to the number of stars. Okay, so statistical significance, how powerful something is going to have more stars. And you can see in this first thing, whether or not a student lived in the Appalachian region, which was, I think, about 45 to 50% of the students, was a very significant predictor of academic functioning. Whether or not a student was African-American, or sorry, this is teacher to student ratio is the second line, was a very significant predictor. So fewer students per teacher, you're going to have better academic functioning. If a student was African-American, was associated with lower academic functioning, as was being a Hispanic student. Here we are, now school start timelines. What is it that's most obvious here? These were slight predictors, but not only do they have fewer stars, if you actually just look at the strength of the number, it's really small. So school start times within this giant model really played a very teeny tiny little role. Okay, compared to some of these other factors. And then the interaction free and reduced lunch, again, plays significant predictor. And the interaction between start time and free lunch was not very strong because start time was not very strong. So then here, when you start looking, what I'd like you to do, she estimated, what if schools start 1 hour apart? How different would their scores be? And on average, the scores between schools, this isn't students, this is the school's average, would be somewhere between 3 and 6 points different. And that might move them from one category to another, but it's not as if this then becomes a failing student, because this isn't looking at students. This is looking at school level data. Anyway, I don't want to beat the horse to death. I just want to say Dr. Keller's a great researcher, and this is a great way of looking at data, but it's not what is seen in the real world. What is seen in the real world is that students are more engaged, they're able to learn, the test scores didn't change. In our district, we looked at this, we looked at grades, we looked at test scores, no changes, other than potentially positive changes, but no negative changes with the start times.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, both Dr. Hassinger and Dr. Meltzer. I appreciate that. And the research and laying that foundation for our school community. So thank you very much for that. And we also, our school community knows on our school start time webpage, we have a lot of the research there. So if anyone wants to dig deeper, they're able to do that. I'm going to shift over to Dr. Larry Wall and Dr. Gary Snyder to really talk about their districts and how they implemented their school start time changes. So, Dr. Wall and Dr. Snyder, both of your districts are similar to Williamsville in regard to academic performance and the robust educational experience that you offer. And Dr. Meltzer spoke about her district being similar to Williamsville in that sense. So, Dr. Snyder, I'll start with you. If you could please explain why the Princeton School District decided to move to later school start times, and what are the sticking points you experienced, as well as the positives that came out of the move?
Great, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here this evening. I'll just back up a little bit and say I was the high school principal, not the superintendent. I was the high school principal at Princeton High School in Princeton, New Jersey from 2003 to 2019. And so over that 16-year period of time, had a lot of experience with the community and the school and the high school, one of the top performing schools in New Jersey and the country, and was doing well by every metric as far as academic achievement. If you looked at AP scores, if you looked at SAT scores, college acceptances, 1 year, the Wall Street Journal listed the top 10 schools sending kids to the Ivies, and Princeton High School was in that top 10 list of schools across the country sending kids to the Ivies. It was the only open enrollment school, as opposed to being a private school or whatnot. So by every metric, as far as academic achievement was going, we were knocking it out of the park. Great kids, great teachers, great community, really doing well. But over time, and to cut that story a little short, by really around 2015, 2016, it had escalated to a point of a lot of concern about our student wellness. And that's where we started. The community knew we had issues. The teachers knew. I was the principal. I knew. The kids knew. The board knew. Everyone knew that we were approaching a crisis around student wellness. And something had to be done. So that is what really pushed us to take a close look at how we were doing school, and maybe a little different from some of the other schools you might have looked at or talked to. We didn't start by looking at later start. In fact, we didn't really know much about it. We started by looking at student wellness and what could help our kids. And that's when we discovered the research around student wellness. We also discovered we were looking at a lot of different things. We were looking at 21st century pedagogy, how teaching and learning in the 21st century. We were looking at how we use our space in the building, and we had architects involved in our conversations. We had talking about how do we use our time. We had a school schedule that the school was built in 1927, and I think that's when the school schedule started in 1927. So went 90 some years without a noticeable change in the schedule. And had a teacher on the faculty, had two who had been teaching there for over 50 years, so they could attest to some of those things. Wow. And the traditions, right? The tradition of excellence, but also what we were finding is this tradition of really suffering with student wellness. And it started to pop with some really tragic news. We had students die by suicide. We, counting then the numbers, we had an increase in student attempts, an increase in psychological evaluation, students being sent out, increase in students being absent for long periods of time based on their wellness. And so again, that's when we started to look at what we could do. I really like to mention we worked with Challenge Success, which is a group out of Stanford University, and they look at schools and student wellness, and they touch upon the later start time. And so we worked with them. It helped us to collect student data. They have a survey that they administer. It's out of Stanford. They've done it for schools across the country. So they have a lot of other comparison points, schools that were like ours. And we learned from that. We had student focus groups, as you were saying, and our high school students. And this is what, as much as we knew, it surprised us the most, our high school students telling us, and these are kids doing great, right? Everything's good on the outside, but they're telling us they're just doing school, that they're starting so early. They can march through school and be compliant and get their good grades and everything looks good, but it's not good. And so that's really what drove us. We then had a decision to make around what we were going to do. Were we going to tinker around the edges and just try to make things a little bit better, or were we really going to explore whole scale reform of how we were doing school at the high school level? And we chose the later. And it's a problem-solving decision, right, of which way you want to go with that. We chose to really look at some things and make some significant changes. We had tried some small changes before, but they weren't seeming to make the case. So through our work with the faculty and with the community, and we had the backing of the community from early on to do something. Now, some of us wanted to do things fast and to follow some templates that were out there. We went a little bit slower. We did about 18 months of work and then had implementation at about the 2-year mark. And in that, we revamped our daily schedule. And what came of that, of course, was a later start. We, just to give people that context, we were starting at 7:50 a.m. and we pushed it back to 8:20 a.m. We were aiming for 8:30. We had conversations about getting to 8:40. The realities of it all, right? And the problem solving and the compromising and making things work in the district, we got to 8:20. I will say academically, our districts might be similar. Princeton's not a large district. Princeton's about 3,500, 3,600 students right now. We had about 1,600 students in the high school. So it's one high school, one middle school, and 4 elementaries. Transportation still was always the complicating piece. And we learned during that, many of us thought, oh, there's only 4 elementaries, 1 middle, and 1 high school. And the transportation person would remind us that they actually ran transportation for about 20 other schools, private schools, charter schools, and so forth in the area that were the transportation was coming from the district, which many of us went, oh, we didn't realize that. So transportation, of course, was a challenge. But we came out with that 8:20, and in a revised schedule, we really did some work around both instructionally and our use of space and our use of time, and came up with a schedule that actually answered for us some of the questions. And I go back to what Dr. Brown Hall said from the beginning. Every district is different, so you have to figure out what works for you. And we varied up our days so that each day was a little bit different, which at first people thought would be super confusing. But our kids created an app to put on your phone so they knew the schedule immediately. And until the adults adapted to the app, then we had to figure it out from there. But the kids figured it out pretty quickly. So we had different end times. Not every day ended at the same time. And that actually helped us with the athletic question that I know will come up, that not all of our days ended at the same time. Well, I should say the instructional time didn't end. So we built in some time within the school day on 2 days out of 6 that allowed some flexibility. Those things being, we did peer group on some afternoons where seniors worked with 9th graders. We did 10th graders were doing their community service on some afternoons. Some kids were doing internships. So things that needed to be done outside of the instructional hours. We built that into our schedule. We did co-curriculars during that time, clubs and so forth. That helped with some issues around equity. The kids who couldn't stay after school were actually able to participate in school activities during the framework of the school day. And so that was how that played out. And as far as process, I think it was really important. I think as you're doing, we heard from the voices. We kept going to the community and to the faculty and to others and trying to explain why we were doing what we were doing, what we were trying to solve, what each iteration might solve. And we did a lot of iterations. We did some testing, we did some trials. On the spring before we made the change, we had a week that we did a late start just to practice and see what that might look like. We did a few different things along the way to test and get some feedback, and to learn from those experiences so that we didn't jump into it all on one point. I think you asked, about a stumbling block, and all of us who were involved chuckle a little bit about it, though it wasn't funny the first day. We changed the high school schedule pretty significantly to a later start time, to that 8:20. Princeton High School was in a neighborhood, so narrow neighborhood streets. Across the street is Westminster Choir College, and right on the other side of the street from there is the Princeton Middle School. And on the first day of school, at dismissal time, we had absolute gridlock. I can laugh about it now, but it was a lesson learned, right? We had done a lot of planning, and somehow nobody said, "What about dismissal time?" And so we had a quick meeting this afternoon, with representatives from the community, representatives from the police department, traffic, the mayor's office, because we had to do some quick overnight things and we actually solved another problem that had been perennial. This street between the middle school and the high school had long talked about. People said, what if we closed that street and made this campus? On one side of the street, you got a middle school, and the other side of the street, a high school, and the other side right there is a small college. What if we made that a campus? And so we got overnight approval to close that street during dismissal time. Actually made for a much safer campus and much safer transportation. So by accident, by missing something really important, we actually solved another problem. And so that was one of the good outcomes. The other outcomes I think you've asked, and our attendance improved for sure. Tardiness improved. So you had mentioned early on, or someone had mentioned, we saw, this is anecdotal, but at arrival time every day, our high school kids were awake, saying hello, good morning, having conversations, as opposed to before that, walking in with their head down, not really ready to recognize the world yet. And so that was pretty significant. We heard from our kids. The change was dramatic for them and really helpful. I left in 2019. I have friends there, colleagues there. A lot of things have changed, but the later start time has remained. People have really, they just accept it as something that's good for kids, and they've worked around any other of the issues they had to work with. I will say, one of our issues we worked with also was faculty children in the district. And so some before and after school care, and the district came through and said, well, we'll provide some additional before and after school care for faculty children, some of their young kids who, whether they were getting dropped off early or picked up later. So the district helped in that regard to help faculty and staff with their children in the district before and after school care. So it feels like a lot in a short period of time, but you might still have some questions for me. So go ahead.
No, there will be more questions, and I appreciate that. I'm going to hop over to Dr. Wall with the Webster Central School District. And Webster, by all accounts in New York State, is considered a like district to Williamsville. And Webster moved their start times about 5 years ago. So Dr. Wall, if you can share with us the Webster story, and then talk about why your district considered the move to later times and how it's going now that it's 5 years later.
Sure, happy to do so. And I'll tell you, I've heard some echoes of the process that we went through, both from the sleep researchers as well as from Dr. Snyder. It was a similar entry point for Webster in that, high performing districts, our kids were doing very well academically. But I specifically remember one of the youth risk behavior survey annual looks. The number of our students at the secondary level who answered the question, I think the question is, I've been deeply sad or uninterested in things, more than twice over the last 2-week period, or something along those lines that was an indication of, being depressed, being disconnected. And our kids were doing school really well, but from a mental health standpoint, we were seeing some cracks around the edges as well. And our board at the time and our superintendent at the time was really committed to the notion of educating the whole student. And so academics were going well. We were concerned about mental health with our students. And, the term that kept coming up is that changing our start times is a modifiable risk factor. Students have a lot of things going on in their lives. Schools don't necessarily have the ability to control many of those things. But when we start our day is something that we can control. And we went through the same learning process where, we looked at the circadian rhythms and how it really is a natural evolution. And in fact, the one data point that we were able to get, we made the shift in fall of 2019. And so COVID hit in spring of 2020, which sort of ran our plans for follow-up surveying off the road. But the one thing that we did do is in the spring of 2019, we asked our 6th through 12th graders, when did you go to bed last night? When did you wake up in the morning? And then a year after COVID sort of settled out, I think it was 2022, we asked that same question. And we saw almost identical to results to the chart that Dr. Meltzer shared. So our 6th, 7th graders, they get about 15, 20 minutes more of sleep every night. But our high school students get 45 minutes or more additional sleep. And what changed was the wake up time, not the go to bed time. So I thought that was super interesting. But we, the other thing that was a motivator is our board had gone to a New York State School Boards Association meeting, and that was the year when NISBA put together a position statement on start times because the research was becoming more widely shared. And so it was the same thing that Dr. Snyder talked about. This is something that we have the power to do, but we don't know whether we'll be able to do it because of all of those logistical concerns. Typically what comes up is busing, scheduling, childcare, athletics. And so what our board asked us to do is we had a public forum night where we had a couple hundred people show up. And we asked for people who were interested in continuing to work on this. And we put together a 60-person committee that was basically 20-20-20. It was 20 teachers, 20 administrators and staff members, 20 parents. And it was further divided into an elementary group and a secondary group. And over the course of the spring of 2019, we said we're going to look at each one of these potential obstacles, and we're going to work as hard as we can to draw out the biggest problems of each. So for instance, for transportation, we had our director of transportation come and we said, what would it look like if we were to try to flip the bus runs? And we had our athletic directors come and we said, what would it look like if our school day didn't end? So our schedule before was 7:20 was the start of the high school day, and it ended at 2:30. And we shifted over to starting now at 8:45, and we end at 3:15. So before we had the classes started at 7:30. So before we had a 7-hour school day at the secondary level, and we shifted to a 6.5-hour school day for students. So we did trim each class just a little bit, but So we asked the athletic directors, what would that look like in terms of our participation in sports in Section 5? And then for childcare, for that evening, we invited several daycare providers who were in Webster to come and say, well, what would it look like? And I think it was, let me see, I think it was it Dr. Meltzer who talked about a daycare savings? Because we shifted for elementary. Our elementary schools start, 5 of the 7 start at 7:50. And 2 of them, because they're on the same campus, they start a little earlier at 7:40. But what parents discovered is rather than having to pay for wrap care before and after, they just do the wrap care after school. So over the course of that spring, it really was, we were digging as hard as we could to find things that could make this not possible, and we just didn't see any. And so we asked the committee to make a vote to provide a recommendation to the board. It was almost unanimous. There was one person, so it was 59-1. And the one person said, I just don't feel like it should be unanimous. And I wish we could wait a little bit longer, because we recommended that we have a full year to prepare. And she was hoping that maybe 2 years would be more useful. So that happened in June. In August, our board voted to approve it for the following school year, so August of 2018. Yep. And then we took a whole school year to build a more robust wrap care program at each of our elementary buildings. We had one person full-time from transportation who worked on redoing those bus routes. And we worked with our athletic directors, worked with the other schools in the section to figure out what scheduling was going to need to happen. And I'm trying to think, there was one more thing. Yeah, but that's about it.
Awesome.
And since moving to it, I'll tell you, I was an English teacher for 23 years before moving into this position. And for most of those years, I taught juniors first period. So at 7:30 in the morning, I was trying to get them to work on English. And I knew that I couldn't do first period, what I could do later in the day with my students.
Right.
And anecdotally, that first year before COVID hit and now, I talked to my former colleagues and they said it's kind of scary. Kids are awake. They're nice. They're talking. And we did some early surveying and we did see what typically happens is absenteeism did go down in terms of late arrival. And there wasn't a significant impact on grades, but athletic eligibility, which was tied to absenteeism, eligibility went up as well at our secondary level.
Dr. Wall, let me ask you this, because you moved your start time in more than an hour. So that's considerable. Did you see after school a reduction in students participating in the extracurricular activities, or did you move more of those to the morning before school started?
So our superintendent and our board at the time was pretty committed to protecting that before school time, because we said the reason that we're doing this is to try to encourage more students to get sleep. We're not doing it so that we can move practices to before school. And so, in fact, the first year there was a pretty hard line there in terms of we're going to do all we can not to schedule activities before school. And there's been a little bit of a leak, but primarily it's still not happening. We did not see a reduction in extracurricular activities or in sports. The students, rightly so, were concerned about that possibility. And the other thing was students who work after school, the upper level high school students, were concerned that they would, not have access to so many different jobs. But employers that work with high school students are generally pretty motivated to keep them working, and so they adjusted the shifts, and so we didn't see any decrease in extracurricular, in athletic participation, and I can't tell you with precision but we really didn't hear anything in terms of the local business community saying, you know what, this has been a problem for us.
Dr. Meltzer, when you did this years ago in Cherry Creek, did you notice any difference in after school activities or students being able to work?
So I'm going to show data again because we did look at this because it's not one of the topics that's looked at, but is of great question. You can see green is again elementary school, pre, post, and then follow-up are the 3 bars. And in elementary school, participation remained the same. Middle school did decrease. Our middle school students were the ones that got out the latest. They got out at 3:45 or 3:50 p.m. And so that we did see a decrease that was expected. And we saw a small decrease in high school as well. What we heard through the focus groups was a lot of that decrease in participation was kids would no longer be able to do both junior varsity and varsity or do the school sport and the club sport. So it didn't actually take away the opportunity to participate. It just meant that kids were doing a few less activities, which in the end is not the worst thing in the world. And in terms of employment, we did see a small drop in that very first year after, but a significant increase in employment 2 years out. So it didn't impact employment overall. And when we broke it down by looking at the students who qualified for free and reduced lunch, the ones who people say these kids really need to work, their employment actually went up post-change and remained up. And so it did not have a negative impact that we saw through our data. And we did hear reports, kids having to leave early for athletics. But honestly, it wasn't that much different than what it was pre-change because there's always transportation time. And when you live in a big region and you have to get to other places, there are some athletic students who have to leave early. It's a choice they make. But our district also, like Dr. Wall was saying, we did not allow before school. If you were not already a before school sport, so things like swimming or hockey that were before school sports could stay that way. But if you were not already that way, you could not move and become a before school club or sport.
Got it. Thank you very much for that. And speaking of sports, we're going to transition. I have some questions for our district athletic director and our director of health and physical education, Mr. Chris Muchika. So, Chris, first of all, with this change, will we see a reduction in the number of sports that we are able to offer?
We would still offer the same sports after school. It wouldn't affect that whatsoever.
Thank you very much for that confirmation. And we've heard from parents that they're concerned with practice times and not having enough space for teams to practice, and later school times will make this even more difficult. Are you able to speak about that or talk about some sample scheduling that we'd be able to do?
So if we're talking about practice, you have to think right now, currently we have a 3 to 5 window after school. We'll take the fall, for example, a 3 to 5 window of which our practices for 11 teams from soccer to football to field hockey are on the turf practicing. That would obviously shift from 3 to 5 to 4 to 6. So our games that start at 5 p.m. or 5:15 would start at 6 or 6:15. And our games that started before at 7 would probably start around 8 o'clock. Give take a soccer, field hockey, lacrosse game is about an hour and a half, barring injuries or timeouts or overtime. So just to keep it simple without mentioning fields and turf and rain and cancellations after school, 3 to 5 practice would shift to 4 to 6. And yes, the games would be an hour later. Other things to factor in with that, what days do teams need full fields? What days do teams play home and away? That separates things. Coaches' communication and coaches' arrival time. Currently, we have a lot of out-of-district coaches that don't get here or can't get here till 4 or 5 o'clock from their job downtown or in the South towns. And then we have logistically, South, for example, has 2 gyms, but 1 game field for turf, whereas the North and East fields, 2 fields can go at once. Even at East, you can play 3 games in the spring at once. So a lot of factors go into the practice schedule, but most importantly, know that those 2-hour windows of practice will maintain their integrity.
Thank you for that. How will this affect our district if we move to a later start time? How will that affect us competing against districts that have earlier start times and earlier end times?
Again, to reiterate, our transportation currently, people may not know this, our high school gets out at 2:45. The earliest bus we can get for a JV or varsity contest is 4 p.m. So knowing that right now, we don't play a game before 5:30 or 6 o'clock currently on the road. So working with other schools, all schools have different rationale for, if you're a Clarence, you're in this situation right now. If you're a Hamburg and you're dealing with bus company issues and can't get a bus till 4:30 or 5 o'clock, we communicate. Sports schedules come out 4 months before the season starts. So we get those schedules to our coaches, to our ADs. We work on games that we need to move times. Parents that are listening right now might not understand, some of your volleyball games start at 5, some start at 6, some start at 7, depending on how it works for both of the schools, factoring also in officials and when they're available. So if anything, our bus situation will relieve itself because our elementaries are our biggest run, followed by middle school and high school. So we would have buses available upon high school dismissal at 3:45 to 4 o'clock. So not much would change. Games wouldn't change. Is there an outlier such as Jamestown before the time change in the spring? Would we need to leave a little early? Absolutely, because they don't have lights on their baseball field. So there's always outliers. There's conversations with our golf program, our bowling program, and our hockey program that we don't control the venue, but we've had conversations with them. So just challenges in scheduling, but things that we're able to rise above.
And I'm sure Dr. Wall, Dr. Meltzer, and Dr. Snyder, you had to do the same thing in your districts, right? Really be accommodating to the athletics and look at each of the sports and their scheduling differently, correct?
Yep, exactly right. You know, and there are this is where planning comes in, because, for instance, it was the golf team, but the golf team, if you think about it, is a small number of students. And there are certain venues, you know, it's getting the kids off of the golf course so that the leagues can get on. And it just was a question of, so it might be that during golf season, we've got 4 kids who are going to miss the last period. But everything was able to be worked out. And what Chris mentioned, it really is about availability of the buses more than when the end of the school day is.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to jump
Can I
over.
just add real quick?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Meltzer. Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things, the busing was very helpful because, as you said, we were able to get buses there faster after school, so the students weren't sitting around waiting for those athletic events.
Right.
But our coaches also had some shorter practices. They actually did shorten and had increased quality practices. They felt like the kids were more awake and alert and not dragging as much, and that the quality of the practices improved even if they were slightly shorter. And so that was something that they were very pleased with.
If I could just add also, obviously the sleep benefit helps athletes as well, right? So getting that extra sleep in the morning does help athletes. The American College of Sports Medicine would speak to that. There's some articles out there of professional athletes talking a lot about the importance of sleep. And so, you know, that benefit of the sleep in the morning benefits athletes as well. And as has been said, you know, some of what you've experienced and your athletic director is talking about, our kids were standing around after school waiting for a bus to go to a game anyway. So it really actually evened that out a little bit and made things a little bit better on that regard. And then just anecdotally, I know Princeton High School, they won some state championships in the last couple of years. And so there has been no decline in their achievement on the sporting field. Last 2 years in New Jersey, winning the state volleyball tournament and in contention for soccer every year and swimming. So athletically, they're performing well.
We won 5 this past fall, not to brag, but which is the most that they've won in one season, and they can't remember how long. So it definitely did not, over the long term, impact our athletic programs.
Thank you very much for all your contributions to that question. I'm going to shift over to our district medical director, then I'm going to circle back to our principals. Christine Harding is our district medical director. And I want to know, Christine, is our district any different than what we're seeing nationally, right? And what our Dr. Meltzer spoke about, and Dr. Snyder and Dr. Wall spoke about, with the need for increased student mental health. I know we got some questions about the research and parents asking, is this a concern in our district?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Brown Hall. So first, I just want to share just a personal story from last night. The timing was really uncanny. I have a 15-year-old son. I was getting ready for my 9:30 bedtime, and he said to me, "Mom, I wish I could go to bed at 9:30. I just can't do it. I go to bed at 11. I'm so tired. I can't wait for the break so I can catch up on some sleep." So he just shared that last night, and I told him I was going to work that into the conversation tonight. So back to your question, no, Williamsville has not been and is not immune to the rising numbers of mental health concerns that are impacting students and families locally, as well as across the state and nation, especially post-COVID. And I know Dr. Wall had just mentioned that. In Williamsville, we continually work to take a proactive approach to addressing mental health concerns with research-based programs, wellness initiatives, our building-based mental health staff, our family support center, as well as our partnerships with community organizations. These proactive approaches are going to continue in our district. However, the research through the NIH, through CDC, through the American Psychological Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, they have really shown that sleep is strongly linked with many psychiatric disorders. And we heard some of that tonight, including depression and anxiety. Further, the research states an effective countermeasure, as Dr. Wall mentioned as well, to chronic sleep loss is delaying school start times. Therefore, modifying this key contributor to chronic sleep loss is a preventive strategy that helps support adolescents holistically, including decreasing student anxiety and depression and increasing their emotional regulation. The research has clearly shown that shifting school start times has led to an increase in average sleep duration, improved mental health, and academic outcomes for our adolescents. This proposal is yet another way that Williamsville is demonstrating a commitment to proactive and preventative measures that support our youth.
Thank you very much for that, Christine. So, because I've heard Dr. Meltzer, Dr. Wall, and Dr. Snyder all talk about data that was collected from their school districts after they actually, approve the switch. And I'm assuming we'd be able to do something similar through your office, probably, right?
Absolutely. As a district, we already have systems in place to track and review data with regard to student absences, tardiness, grades, achievement, health office visits, referrals such as discipline. Should Williamsville modify our school start times, we're going to continue to track, monitor, review, and compare this data. In addition, it's also important to note that we gather student and teacher survey data that provides deeper understanding around students' social emotional health and well-being as it relates to protective factors and developmental assets. We're going to continue gathering this information as well. And I know Webster Central School District conducted a review of research that led to their change in school start times. And because, again, as Dr. Wall said, it's what was best for kids. As a member myself of the Williamsville School Start Time Committee, we also conducted that extensive literature review and the body of evidence concerning the academic benefits, in addition to the medical research into the function of the brain and the link between sleep and physical and mental health, is unequivocal. We know that student attendance is crucial for academic success, to which the research was clear that later school start times generally correspond to not only improved attendance, but better grades, less tardiness, and less falling asleep in class. And we anticipate seeing the same academic and health benefits here in Williamsville.
Thank you very much for that. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to hop over to our principals, Principal Boardman and Principal Wall, who are also members of the School Start Time Committee. Now, Principal Boardman, if you can clarify for us, because there was some initial confusion regarding busing to Harkness in the morning. So can you just help us with that? Will busing be provided?
Yes. Yeah, I think the confusion probably came from perhaps how we presented the slide. And so one of the things that needs to happen is we actually have to figure out which students are going to Harkness before we can figure out how the busing, what the busing will look like and what the best way for us to do that. But busing will be provided. In fact, I spoke to one of the supervisors over at BOCES the other day because he had received questions about that as well. And I assured him no students who attend AM Harkness will be bused.
Thank you very much for that. And so I know it's not ideal to move any extracurriculars to the morning prior to school, but do we already have extracurricular activities in the morning prior to our 7:45 a.m. start time at the high school?
We do, and in fact, some of our larger extracurricular clubs, some of our music performing groups, they perform in the morning. I know here at South, our National Honor Society often meets in the mornings. Student Congress meets in the mornings, and I think it's fair to say that we're going to continue having some of our groups meeting in the mornings. I think, like Dr. Meltzer said, one of the things, when we say we want to make sure that we are at least, keeping up with what our promise is, which is that the goal of this is to actually get those high school students more sleep. What we don't want to see is a sudden shift of all of these things that used to be after school, just throwing them into the morning now. And so, one of the reasons, for instance, I'll give you a good example, and I spoke to one of my music department members today. We were actually talking about this, and one of the reasons the music students actually do their rehearsals in the mornings is because many of them are involved in other activities after school, including athletics. And so we want to make sure that those students are still having those opportunities, to join those teams, do play sports, do music, be at clubs. We want to ensure that as much as possible, the students can do that. So we will. Currently, obviously, we start at 7:45. Right now, these groups actually start, their meetings are at 7 a.m. So even with pushing the start time back, should we go that way, they will still be meeting almost an hour later than they currently are.
Thank you very much for that. So there was a question about opportunities for teachers. And so Principal Wall and Principal Boardman, if teachers are able to flex their schedules, and it's my understanding we do have some of this going on in our schools already. So will this continue, and how will it be determined?
Yeah, and I can share that, at South, we have multiple flex schedules for teachers. Really, the way it's determined and the way that it's done at the high schools, and I would assume the middle schools also, is based on our need for flex positions. Primarily for us, what we use flex positions for is to cover areas when we do have students who are coming into school where we might not necessarily have supervision. So, for instance, I have 4 each day. I have 4 flex schedules: 2 before school, 2 after school. We cover the cafeteria and we cover the library. We want to ensure that the library is open before school and after school. I had this question actually from another teacher, whether or not we would still have flex schedules. I fully believe that we will absolutely have flex schedules. What I don't know right now, and what I do think is possible, is that we might have the need for more or different flex schedules as this changes, and that's certainly something that we are open to. It's a benefit for some of our teachers. It's also a benefit for us as administrators in figuring out how to serve our students.
Thank you. Dr. Wall. Our Dr. Wall. Do you have that at the middle school also? Flex schedules?
Not as much, but we do have that option, so we would still maintain that opportunity. We're not really sure to what extent we would need that, because the shift isn't as big for us in the middle school.
Thank you very much for that. So let me ask this. So as part of the school start time committee, were there other options explored? So we got the proposal at the January board meeting. Were there other options explored? And if so, why were they dismissed?
Yeah, I mean, we explored, and I'll have Dan jump in on this too. I mean, we explored numerous other options. I mean, we're probably looking at, dozens and dozens of options, and they ranged from, some options that were, completely different in terms of what order, which levels might be going in. We had options, a good example is, one of the options that we were looking at really all the way up through November and into December was trying to find a way to get all 6 elementary schools to go at the exact same time. So we spent a lot of time looking at different options. Some of them were just different, maybe 5-10 minutes this way, 5-10 minutes that way. And really, we spent that time looking at all those different options, talking about it as we kind of got closer to looking at all of the logistical issues. And, I think everybody on the panel sort of chuckled when transportation was mentioned, because we all know that that's a huge function of what we do when we talk about this. And there's no doubt, we had some ideas of, hey, here's kind of our targets. And this is what we're looking at coming out of this committee. And then from there, the logistical realities began to set in. And I think Dan could probably add to that also.
Yeah, and I think, one of the other things that really helped shape our thinking was when we met Dr. Meltzer and Dr. Snyder in Baltimore at our conference, and the gentleman also out of Stanford who was presenting. When we left that concert, we really made a concerted effort to put the research first. So we were going to always try to say, especially because there wasn't much conflicting research on these positions. So we really took a hard look at what the research was saying and said, if we're really going to make this more of a health issue than a convenience issue for for employees or for certain stakeholders, but if we really prioritize the health needs of our students and follow the research first, so that started to shift our priorities by even saying the order of the schools. Elementary, middle, high. Like there was a logical reason for that based in the research. Because some questions initially were maybe it's just a high school thing, and then logistics come into play. And once you realize it's difficult to just move one school, we had to go back to the research time and time again to make that our priority. So as much as we can, we've tried to stay as close to the research as possible.
Yeah, and I think importantly, one of the things to add to that too is as we've done that, as I mentioned, those logistical factors, you start adding those things in. So, at the high school, certainly one of the things, and I know Dr. Brown Hall, this, when a year and a half ago or longer, when you asked me about if I would be interested in being on the committee and possibly chairing it, I think the first name I brought up as a high school principal was Chris Mujica, because I said anytime we're talking about changing school start times, you're talking about changing school end times. As a high school principal, I'm concerned about athletics. And so when we talk about going through the different options that we were going through, we also had all of those parameters that were put in place as you're looking at it. And you do have to go through that. I mean, the reality of the logistical aspect of doing all of this in a district like ours, 13 schools, transportation, athletics, all of those different things, you're trying to accommodate all of those things as best you possibly can in your proposal.
Thank you. And one thing I want to reference what Dr. Snyder said also, because we do provide so much additional transportation to private schools, parochials, charter schools even. So we do provide a lot of other transportation, not just busing to our 13 schools. And when we looked at one of the proposals attempting to move all of our elementary schools to the same time, I believe the total cost over a 4-year period was $3.2 million. And so we have to be very mindful of that to our tax-paying stakeholders too. So thank you very much for that. So how will childcare needs be handled with elementary school children getting home very early in the afternoon with parents working? Did we think about that, principals?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently our 4 elementary schools dismiss about 30 to 35 minutes earlier than the high schools. However, this proposal will have all 6 elementary schools dismissing before high schools. So 4 of which would be an hour and 40 minutes and 2 of which will be an hour and 10 minutes. So knowing this is a significant change, the district in our committee reached out to our local childcare organizations to ensure the changes could be supported. Specifically, we contacted over a dozen childcare providers to make sure that our buses currently drop off students to, and we received assurances from them that they would be able to accommodate the increased demand for after-school daycare. So early dismissal for our high school students who do not have classes scheduled at the end of the day will still be available. And also, although the proposal still allows for middle school and now possibly high school students to support younger students in the morning for our working parents who need to leave early for work,
Right.
There is a continued need for families to account for after-school care of elementary students. But we know it takes a village to raise children, and while some parents may rely on family members or neighbors with after-school care, in addition, we're pretty confident the community's providers can also meet the demand.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So that's very important. That was a question that was brought up time and time again. And so what we will do, though, we will also, we spoke to our child care providers just about being able to accommodate additional students. And, they agreed and asserted that they would be able to, especially with the timing that we're giving them if this proposal is approved. With the timing we're giving them, they're able to accommodate that. And then we'll also have to ask them to be very mindful of the timing that before school may not need, but the after school will need. And then for JFK that operates in our buildings, really talking to them about the cost structure for the additional 15 minutes or 20 minutes per day some of our elementary families will need. So thank you very much for that. So I want to, with only 9 minutes left, I do want to tackle some of these other questions that I can definitely answer. So a question that kept coming up, why are we changing the school start times and what led to this decision? Well, this is something that actually Board of Education members, even prior to my arrival, and this is my 4th year in the district, even prior to my arrival, parents at community forums, students asked if that can be looked into because high school start time was so early. And we know that even at the March Community Forum last year, parents asked this, students were asking this. And so we said, let's form a committee that would review the research for an entire year and then work during 1 year to then develop a proposal. That's why we had the research. We have our school start time website, our timeline, held focus groups, and then work to try to figure out what combination of school start times is something that the district could definitely move forward with. So that's what led to this decision to look at school start times. It was really an ask by parents and students. So another question was, does the parent feedback actually get considered? And I will tell you, yes. This question came up at the Parent Teacher Student Association Council meeting on last Monday evening. And the question was, do board members look at all of this feedback? And as you heard earlier, we've gotten over 1,600 pieces of feedback and emails. And our board president, vice president, and all 7 other board members look at each and every piece of that feedback because it informs their decision making and any additional questions they have. So they are considering each pieces of those feedback. And I will let you know our board is taking this very seriously and looking at all of that so they understand the pulse of the community. Why are the high school students and parents who are the most affected by time changes not able to vote on this issue? The voting on this issue is really delegated to the Board of Education. So the way it works, our community votes on our school budget and when we have large construction items. The community also votes for Board of Education members. Our Board of Education, they are the ones responsible for voting and either approving or not approving the school start time proposal. So that's why. And we also want to make sure that our board members, what they're doing, they're looking at the feedback, but they're also very cognizant of the research. A lot of times when we put these things like this, if they were to go to a community vote, many times it would be what is more convenient for my situation and my routine, not necessarily what's in the best interest of students. So we have to be mindful of that also. How does the district plan to ensure the safety of younger children who will now have to wait for buses in the early morning darkness, particularly in winter months? The thing about this is that when we move our elementary start times to the first start time, our buses are really not late for those pickups. So our elementary students don't have to wait in the darkness as much as they would if they were on a second or third run where the buses may be running late, especially when we get into the winter months. Why does the change of school start time come at the expense of our youngest children? And it indeed does not. We are looking at a complete K-12 model of school start times. And we realize that the research says moving high school to a later start time is very, very beneficial. And we also have some research that shows moving elementary to an earlier start time can be beneficial for them. Now, we heard Dr. Meltzer say that 8 a.m. might be a sweet spot as opposed to 7:50, right? And we know that with Senate Bill 2361, that if that were to move out of Education Committee, we may have some adjustments to do. So that's something that we can definitely take a look at also. So thank you very much for those questions. I want to open it up now to any last minute thoughts that any of our panelists want to leave with our school community around school start times. If there's anything you think we didn't ask that we want to take a moment to stress, we have about 5 minutes left. If there's some parting words of wisdom you want to leave with us as a district because you've gone through this already, or you want to make sure it's a lasting thought that we consider, this is your time.
I'll just add that I wish you the best in this process, and that it has been a good journey for Webster. And I think all of our students are in a better spot because of the shift. Of course, there were some adjustments, and there will be some things that are difficult to anticipate. But you know, it is a modifiable risk factor, and it is worth the effort. We've seen some great results in Webster.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Wall.
I don't have anything new to say that I haven't said, though I've appreciated hearing your process, and I think that's a really important piece. The work that you've done examining the different ways to solve the problems and the communication with all the stakeholders, I think is an important piece, and I commend you and your district for that work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd just add change is hard and scary. And when we don't know what it's going to be like, it seems worse than it actually is sort of my message. And again, having lived through this as an elementary school parent and hearing all the fears and concerns of the elementary school parents, I mean, I get it. It is a big change for our youngest kids. I will tell you, having the buses on time every morning was delightful for a change, and as well as in the afternoons, they get dropped off first. And so you're not waiting around at the bus stop, you know, when the buses are running late and that type of thing. 9 to 12 hours is what we're looking at for sleep in elementary school kids. On average in our district, they're getting 10 and a half. That went down to 10.4. And then for the 3rd through 5th graders, they were getting about 9.7 to 9.6. So they were getting still sufficient amount of sleep. We did not see changes in sadness, worried, feeling nervous, feeling too tired. Our elementary school kids, and I'll tell you, I held my breath until I looked at that first data because I was so worried that I had made promises that weren't going to be fulfilled. And again, ours is not the only district that's moved elementary school times earlier, and there have been no significant issues from any district I know that has done it. And that it's hard and it's hard to think about, but it can work. And the benefits across for parents of middle and high school students, they sleep more. Teachers of middle and high schools, they sleep more. And for teacher retention, I got to tell you, that's a big thing to be able to get some more sleep. So those are my final thoughts, that it's a great thing. I'm very happy your school district is thinking about it, whether or not you choose to do it for this year or for next year, but it's a great thing for everybody involved.
Thank you very much. And, you know, I want to thank all of our panelists, and I know Dr. Hassinger had to step off, but I want to thank Dr. Hassinger, Dr. Meltzer, our Dr. Wall, Principal of Transit, Dr. Wall from Webster, Dr. Snyder from Virginia Tech, our Athletic Director, Chris Muchika, Principal Boardman, I can't thank you enough for chairing this committee. Thank you very much. And then Christine Harding, our District Medical Director, thank you very much. One additional question was asked from our school community: why didn't we hold this in one of our schools? Why didn't we hold it live? And it's because many of our panelists don't live local, right? So Dr. Wall is in Webster, Dr. Meltzer is in Colorado, Dr. Snyder is in Virginia. So I appreciate you volunteering your time to be on this meeting this evening. And I consider you a great resource. So if we have additional questions that come up, I will be emailing you, or Principal Boardman may be emailing you just to get some quick answers. So again, thank you very much. I want to thank our school community for tuning in this evening. And again, this will be recorded. It will be on our district website. Use this recording as a resource. Thank you very much. And you all have a great evening. Thanks again. Bye-bye.